Tall girl, hiding in the trees, hears the Vampire King's guards speaking a language they think no one understands. But she does. In those Russian whispers she uncovers a plan to turn a royal meeting into a massacre. Now, only a child stands between a king and catastrophe. The castle had been built to intimidate the living long before the Vampire King claimed it, all black stone and narrow windows that drank in moonlight instead of letting it pass. Around it, the forest huddled close, a ring of twisted trees and thorny undergrowth that discouraged visitors even in daylight. At night, the branches looked like reaching hands, and the wind carried old whispers through the leaves. Those who lived in the distant village at the forest's edge avoided looking toward the hill after sunset. Only one pair of eyes watched the castle with curiosity instead of fear. The little girl lived in a lean-to cottage that pressed almost shyly against the tree-line, as if trying to hide from both forest and fortress. Her world was small: the crooked path to the well, the garden patch where stubborn plants clung to the soil, the mossy stones along the stream that marked the furthest she usually dared to wander. Yet she often slipped past those boundaries, venturing into the edges of the Vampire King's domain with quiet steps and a beating heart. Curiosity tugged at her stronger than caution ever could. She knew of the Vampire King not from stories told by family, but from the way the village behaved at his name. Grown-ups lowered their voices, crossing themselves or touching bits of iron they carried. Children were warned to stay away from the forest. No one mentioned the king's guards, the pale men with heavy boots who sometimes passed through the village, but the girl watched them from shadows and learned to recognize their clipped march and the smell of cold metal they left behind. Over time she found paths through the trees that let her draw closer to the castle without being seen. She learned which routes to avoid, where the stones shifted underfoot, where the underbrush thickened into a wall that only a small body could slip through. These secret routes became her hidden roads, each one leading to a different vantage point from which to observe the strange world around the Vampire King. She did not understand the politics of his court, the ancient debts and dark pacts that bound the region to its monarch. She only knew that the castle was a place of danger and wonder, and that something important was about to happen there, because lately the guards had been more restless, more numerous, and more likely to glance nervously toward the tree line as if expecting eyes like hers to be watching. Part 2. One evening, clouds smothered the moon so completely that the forest floor sank into a deeper darkness than usual. Lanterns burned along the path leading to the castle, eerie orange beads of light strung up the hill. From her hiding place behind a moss-covered rock, the girl watched a patrol of guards descend toward the edge of the forest, their armor muted but their presence heavy. She stayed very still, her breath small and shallow. The guards halted near a bend in the path, close enough that she could see the faint gleam of their fangs when they shifted their jaws, restless and impatient. They stood in a loose circle, boots scuffing the dirt, hands resting on sword hilts more out of habit than need. It was not their weapons that unsettled her, but their voices. They spoke in a language that seldom reached the village, a harsh and flowing tongue she had only heard once before from a passing traveler at the well. It was Russian, though she did not know the name, only its sound and the memories packed inside it. Long ago, before the cottage by the forest, before this land of whispering trees, she had slept under different roofs and listened to different conversations. Some of those voices had spoken this language. The words had settled into her bones, and never quite left. Now, as the guards talked, fragments of meaning drifted to her through the darkness. They believed they were safe behind their unfamiliar tongue, but it was not unfamiliar to her. She heard mention of a meeting, of important guests summoned under promise of protection. She heard the name of the Vampire King used with cold respect. Beneath those details lay the shape of something worse. The guard spoke of a trap to be sprung, of an ambush perfectly laid, of an opportunity too rare to waste. The words for blood, for iron, for fire, slipped through the conversation like teeth glinting in a smile. Unease tightened in her chest. She pieced the fragments together, her mind working faster than her heartbeat. There would be a gathering, and at that gathering there would be violence, carefully planned, hidden behind the veil of courtesy. The Vampire King, who ruled these lands from his shadowed halls, was meant to be caught unprepared. The guards were not simply serving him tonight, they were aligning themselves with something else, something waiting in the wings with hungry patience. The girl could not see the ambush, but she could hear its outline in the rhythm of their words. By the time the patrol moved on and the sound of their boots faded into the night, fear and certainty had knotted together inside her like a single thread. Part 3. She crouched in the dark long after the guards had vanished up the path, listening to the forest settle back into its usual sounds. An owl's low call drifted through the branches, and somewhere far off a fox barked once, then went quiet. Yet the girl felt as though the entire world held its breath, suspended above a chasm that only she could see. The knowledge she carried now had weight. It pressed on her small shoulders and filled the narrow spaces of her thoughts. She had never been responsible for anything larger than a basket of vegetables or a pail of water. Now, the safety of a king and his unknown guests seemed to rest on whether she chose to act. The idea of approaching the Vampire King was like imagining herself stepping willingly into a storm. Everything she knew about him had been painted in shadows and warnings. He was a creature of ancient nights, a being older than the stones of his castle, a ruler whose mercy was as terrifying as his anger. Mortals bargained with him carefully, if at all. Children did not walk into his domain with news and expect to walk out again unchanged. Yet doing nothing felt worse. The thought of the upcoming meeting, of the planned ambush, grew in her mind like a fire spreading through dry grass. She imagined the sudden crash of treachery, the clash of steel and the smell of spilled blood, the aftermath echoing out to the villages and forests beyond. Her small fingers dug into the damp earth as she weighed the paths before her. She could return to her cottage, pretend she had never heard the conversation, and hope that adults somewhere else would notice what she had noticed. But she knew how unlikely that was. The guards trusted the secrecy of their language. The villagers fearfully avoided the castle, and no one else had been close enough to listen. The chain of events poised above the coming night's meeting would fall exactly as planned unless some unexpected force struck through it. It occurred to her, with a shiver, that she might be that force. The thought did not make her feel brave. It made her feel cold and very small, but it also steadied her, as if the world had abruptly become simpler. Either she tried to intervene or she stood aside and watched what came. There was no third option that allowed her to both know and remain untouched. In that clarity she found a strange kind of strength. She rose from her hiding place, brushed dirt from her knees, and turned her face toward the looming silhouette of the castle. The path ahead was steep, and the risks were greater than she could fully grasp, but the decision had already been made inside her. She would find a way to reach the Vampire King before the meeting took place, and she would carry the warning only she could give. Part 4. Getting close to the heart of the castle required a different kind of courage than listening from the forest shadows. As the girl crept up the hill, she felt each step drag at her feet as though the ground itself tried to hold her back. The air grew colder the nearer she came, the lights from the windows turning from distant sparks to watching eyes. At the outer wall, she slipped through a narrow gap where roots had pushed stones apart over many seasons. Inside the courtyard, the scent of iron and smoke mingled with the faint trace of something older, like dust and ancient wine. She moved along the edges of the space, keeping to the shadows cast by empty carts and stacked barrels. Servants hurried across the flagstones, their faces tight with purpose. They carried trays and led pack animals and arranged torches in brackets, all the small tasks that signaled preparation for an important event. None of them noticed a skinny child pressed flat behind a pillar, breathing slowly and counting their steps. Above, tall windows glowed with steady light. Somewhere within those walls, the Vampire King waited. Somewhere else, the guards she had overheard polished their armor and sharpened their blades, rehearsing the motions of betrayal. The girl knew she could not simply walk into the throne hall. She needed a moment of access that did not rely on permission. Following the servants, she found an open stairwell leading upward and slipped inside, climbing quickly before anyone could question her presence. The corridors above were quieter, lined with tapestries and unlit sconces. She could feel the pulse of the castle around her, a slow, patient rhythm like a heartbeat echoing through stone. It guided her steps more than any map could have. She gravitated toward the largest doors, the places where the air felt charged and important. Eventually she reached a wide landing overlooking a smaller hall, where a pair of guards stood on either side of an ornate doorway. Even from a distance she recognized them as belonging to the king's inner circle, their armor finer, their expressions watchful. Whoever waited beyond that door mattered more than anyone else in the building. She did not need to see the figure seated within to know that the Vampire King was near. Her chance lay here, at this threshold. Her appearance startled the nearest guard, but there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes alongside suspicion. Children did not appear in royal corridors without cause. The girl felt her courage compress into something sharp and focused. With no words spoken aloud that the world could echo back, she let her fear and urgency pour into her gaze, her posture, the way she held her hands. She conveyed that she carried something vital, something that could not wait. The guard's brow furrowed as he studied her, perhaps sensing the strange weight that had settled on this small intruder. Reluctantly, with a silent gesture, he signaled for her to be brought before the one who could decide whether she would be heard or cast out. Part 5. The chamber beyond the guarded doorway was large but strangely quiet, its walls hung with heavy fabric that swallowed sound. Candles burned in intricate iron holders, their flames steady despite the draft that slipped under the doors. At the far end of the room, the Vampire King sat in a high-backed chair that was more a symbol than a seat, carved with patterns older than the language of the guards. His presence filled the space with a stillness that felt deeper than silence. Eyes that had watched centuries pass regarded the girl with a measured, inscrutable attention. She felt, for a moment, as if she were standing at the edge of a vast, dark sea. Fear brushed against her like cold waves, but beneath it ran the same stubborn thread of resolve that had carried her from the forest. Without speaking, she unfolded the story inside her mind and offered it up. She let the memory of the guard's Russian words rise to the surface, shaping her thoughts around them. She pictured the hill path, the circle of armored figures, the talk of a meeting shrouded in courtesy but edged in treachery. She recalled the specific words for ambush, for blood, for a strike timed to shatter trust. Though no sound left her lips, the girl's knowledge moved through the room in the way her eyes sharpened, the way her hands traced small, tense patterns in the air, the way her breath hitched when she reached the imagined moment of attack. She understood instinctively that this ruler, forged in the long dark of many nights, could read more than ordinary speech. The Vampire King watched her with an intensity that tested the strength of her resolve. As she finished, as her shoulders slumped with the effort of handing over everything she knew, a subtle change passed through his posture. Orders followed, quiet and efficient. The meeting, planned so carefully and awaited with such anticipation by allies and enemies alike, was unraveled in a series of swift decisions. Messengers were redirected. Invitations were recalled or altered. The location was changed, then the time, then the form of the gathering itself, until the trap that had seemed unshakable collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. The conspirators who had relied on secrecy found themselves grasping at empty air, their ambush robbed of its moment. No clash of steel erupted in the hall that night, no sudden spray of violence to stain the castle's stones anew. The catastrophe she had envisioned remained only that, an unwoven future discarded before it could take shape. Later, long after the decisions were carried out and the danger passed into the realm of things that might have been, the girl slipped back through the servants' corridors and out into the forest. The castle behind her still loomed, but it felt less like a looming threat and more like a watchful presence. The trees greeted her with familiar rustling. The villagers would never know how close they had come to being caught in the echoes of a royal disaster. The guards who had spoken so carelessly in Russian would never suspect that a child had unmade their scheme. Only the Vampire King carried the full shape of the story, and he kept it folded away like a private document, a reminder that even in a kingdom of shadows and ancient powers, sometimes the smallest voice, the quietest listener, could bend the path of the night. The clouds gathered early that evening, spreading a dull gray lid over the sky until the first stars disappeared and the moon shrank behind a thick, colorless veil. The forest drank in the darkness greedily, as if it had been waiting all day to pull shadows close around its roots and branches. The girl slipped between tree trunks that looked like crooked pillars, her bare feet knowing where the ground dipped and where it rose, where old roots waited like hidden fingers to snag the careless. The familiar path to her watching place wound through bracken and low shrubs, then climbed gently toward the hill where the Vampire King's castle sat like a dark crown. Each breath she took tasted of damp bark and leaf mold and the faint smoke from distant chimneys where the village still clung to its small circle of light. Along the hill path leading up to the castle, lanterns had been hung at regular intervals. At a distance they looked like beads of dim fire threaded through the gloom, pulsing softly with each stroke of the wind. She could tell at once that there were more of them than usual. On most nights, only a few lanterns burned, enough to keep servants from stumbling and to warn travelers that this road belonged to someone who needed no light to see. Tonight, the line of soft orange eyes stretched farther down than she had ever seen, an illuminated spine running from the castle gates to the lower bends of the path. Something was different, and the difference prickled along her arms and the back of her neck. Her usual hiding place waited near one of those lower bends, where a large rock, split long ago by frost and time, rose from the earth like a broken tooth. Moss and lichen clung stubbornly to its sides, and thin saplings leaned around it as if seeking shelter. From behind that rock, she could watch the path without being seen by anyone coming down from the castle. She moved toward it with quick, light steps, placing her feet where she had placed them 100 times before, until the rough curve of the stone rose up in front of her. She slipped behind it and settled into the shallow hollow she had worn there over many evenings of watching, her knees drawn close, her eyes fixed on the ribbon of lantern-lit path. The air felt heavier than on other nights, weighed down not by storm yet but by anticipation of something unnamed. Even the forest seemed to sense it. The wind held back, rustling only occasionally through the treetops, as if not wanting to draw attention. Birds that usually called and fluttered in the dusk had already gone quiet hours earlier, leaving only the occasional wingbeat of an unseen owl for company. The girl rested her chin on her hands and listened, the way one listens for footsteps in the distance before they have actually begun, imagining the vibration of boots through the earth and the faint jingle of metal. Eventually, the sounds she expected arrived. The muffled clink of armor, the heavy rhythm of coordinated strides, the low murmur of voices carried up from below the bend in the path. She tensed instinctively, then steadied herself, reminding her muscles that hiding was part of what she did best. A moment later, a patrol came into view, 6 guards in dark armor that seemed to drink in the lantern light rather than reflect it, their cloaks whispering around their legs. Their faces were pale beneath their helmets, with the stretched, tense look that came from living long under the rule of nights instead of days. Faint glimmers at the corners of some mouths hinted at fangs not fully withdrawn. They halted near her rock, the leader lifting a gloved hand to signal the pause. The patrol gathered into a loose circle, boots scraping the packed dirt as they shifted their weight. The girl pressed herself more tightly against the stone and slowed her breathing, grateful for the deepening darkness. She could see them clearly enough from the gaps between saplings and the uneven edge of the rock, but she doubted they could see her unless they moved closer and peered around deliberately. The lantern nearest them swung gently in the wind, throwing moving shadows across their armor and faces, cutting them into fragments of light and dark. What drew her attention more than their stance or the shine of their swords was the sound of their voices. The language they used was not the one she heard in the village, nor the rough dialect of traders who sometimes passed through, nor the polished speech of the castle servants she had occasionally overheard near the lower gates. It was the other language, the one buried deeper in her memory, the one that had traveled quietly with her from a former life she rarely thought about. Before the cottage near the forest, and before this land with its vampire king, there had been another place, another roof, other faces, and in that time this language had filled the evenings. She had been younger then, small enough to sit hidden under tables while adults spoke above her heads, believing her too absorbed in scraps of cloth and spoon handles to understand anything important. They had been wrong. Children listened, even when they appeared not to, and their minds took impressions of words and phrases, storing them like seeds. Over the years since she had left that life behind, she had forgotten many details, but the sounds had remained, dormant but not erased. Now, hearing that same language ripple through the night from the mouths of the vampire king's guards, she felt those old seeds stir and open. Meaning rose slowly but decisively from the flow of syllables. They spoke of preparations first, the kind of small, practical things that wrapped themselves around larger plans. A check of weapons, an adjustment to patrol rotations, a reminder that certain doors should be unbarred at certain hours, while others should remain firmly closed. The girl latched onto familiar terms: steel, gate, tower, courtyard. The routine nature of these details almost lulled her for a moment, making her wonder if she had imagined the strangeness in the air. But then one of the guards, his voice lower and less cautious than the others, mentioned the meeting. The meeting had been common knowledge in the village, though only in whispers. Important visitors were expected at the castle, people whose movements affected not just this region but lands farther away, people whose agreements and arguments would shape how much blood and grain and coin moved between kingdoms for years to come. The adults in the village knew only that the Vampire King had called them and that the outcome might determine whether life grew easier or harder. For them it was a distant event, as abstract as rumors of storms on another sea. For the girl, hearing its mention in this hidden language, it suddenly became immediate and sharp. The guards referred to the Vampire King with a cold, measured respect, using a title she recognized as belonging to someone placed far above ordinary soldiers. Yet the tone they adopted when they spoke of him did not carry loyalty. It carried calculation. Beneath that brittle respect, she heard the scraping of something harder, like stone on stone, the sound of long resentment and careful planning. Phrases emerged clearly now: perfect opportunity, gathered in one place, bound by courtesy and expectation, assured by guarantees of safety. As she listened, the conversation turned more open, more confident, as if the shared secrecy of their language had convinced the guards that the night itself belonged to them. They spoke of positions along corridors and balconies, of vantage points near the hall where the guests would assemble. There were references to hidden signals, to a particular moment when all attention would be fixed on ceremony and welcome. Then came the words that twisted her quiet unease into something jagged and undeniable: ambush, first strike, break their power before they know they are in danger. The word for ambush in that language landed heavily in her mind, connected to other stories she had half heard long ago about raids on roads and surprise attacks near mountain passes. Alongside it came terms associated with bloodshed and sudden violence: blades drawn without warning, lines broken before they could form, chaos blooming inside what had been ordered and controlled. The guards described how swiftly the meeting could be transformed from a stage for negotiation into a slaughter pit. They discussed where the Vampire King would stand, where the most influential of his guests would sit, how best to ensure that none of them escaped once the trap closed. Her fingers tightened around the moss at the base of the rock, tearing at it unconsciously. The rough texture against her skin anchored her in the present as the images conjured by their words flickered through her imagination. She saw the great hall, which she had never actually entered yet somehow could picture: high ceilings, banners, long tables, fine cups glinting in candlelight. She imagined those banners torn, the tables overturned, the cups rolling and spilling dark liquid onto the floor, some of it wine and some of it something thicker. She saw figures in fine clothing, their faces first relaxed, then confused, then terrified. She saw the Vampire King rising, perhaps too late, fangs bared in anger and surprise, while blades meant for him and the others flashed from hiding places. The guard spoke not only of killing but of timing, of messages sent to allies beyond the walls, of secondary forces waiting near the village ready to move once the castle's power structure was shattered. If the meeting ended in massacre, the shock would ripple out in every direction. The region would be stunned, its ruler weakened or destroyed, its agreements in tatters. Those who had planned this night would step forward from behind masks already prepared, presenting themselves as unavoidable replacements in the chaos. The girl did not know the names behind these schemes, but she understood enough of human nature to recognize that someone had much to gain from such an event. She leaned closer to the rock, straining to catch each sentence as it flowed in that familiar not familiar tongue. Every detail she absorbed added another weight to the invisible scale inside her. The guards believed they were perfectly concealed by their choice of language, confident that no one in this land of different speech would grasp their true intentions. They talked too freely because of that assurance. They made jokes that sat uneasily alongside plans for blood, their low laughter sliding past words like corpse, ashes, ruined alliances. To them, these things were pieces on a board, positions in a game they had chosen to play. Time stretched uncomfortably as she listened. It felt as though the world had narrowed to the circle of armored figures and the space behind the rock where she crouched. Nothing else existed, not the village, not the cottage, not the earlier days of simple routines. Only the awareness that she now carried something she had not meant to carry, something that did not belong to a child hidden in the forest. She realized that if she stepped away from this knowledge, if she tried to push it out of her mind and walk home as if nothing had happened, it would cling to her like cold fog. She would never again sit by the stream or fetch water from the well without imagining the castle broken and the land reshaped by an event she could have tried to prevent. Eventually, the patrol's discussion wound down. Instructions were repeated, adjustments suggested, small but significant changes agreed upon. The guard who had spoken most boldly spat into the dirt, a gesture of contempt for those they planned to deceive, and the others shifted back into their tight formation. With a final glance down the path, they resumed their march uphill, boots drumming softly against the earth. The lanterns swayed as they passed, throwing the shadows of their helmets and cloaks long and thin across the ground, like dark fingers reaching toward the trees. Then they were gone, swallowed by the bend in the path and the thickening night. Silence rolled back into the space they had left, but it was not the same silence that had existed before. It was heavier, layered with the echo of their words and the outline of the plot she had pieced together. The girl remained behind the rock, unmoving, long after their footsteps had faded, her body stiff, her mind turning over the fragments she had gathered. She repeated certain phrases to herself in that old language, testing them to make sure she had not misheard. Each repetition confirmed the same conclusion. A meeting was coming, and at that meeting there would be an ambush. The Vampire King and his guests would walk into a carefully prepared disaster, convinced they were stepping into a hall of parley and protection. In the shadow of the moss-covered stone, her heart beat harder, not with the fleeting fear of being caught spying, but with the slower, deeper fear of understanding. She knew now that the world she lived in stood very close to a knife edge. The night above her, with its hidden moon and layered clouds, felt like a lid closing over a pot about to boil. She was the only one, as far as she knew, who had seen the steam beginning to rise. The stillness that followed the retreat of the guards lay over the path like a heavy blanket, but inside the girl everything was moving too fast. Her heart thudded against her ribs, trying to remind her she was small and alone and very far from any place that could be called safe. She remained crouched behind the rock, feeling the cold seeping steadily through her thin clothes from the stone at her back and the damp earth beneath her. Moss clung to her fingers where she had gripped it too hard, its green smeared dark against her skin. She stared at the place where the patrol had vanished around the bend, as if their shapes might waver back into view and prove that she had misheard everything, that the night could still be ordinary. Nothing reappeared. The lantern nearest her swayed once more on its hook, then settled. Far up the hill, closer to the castle, faint movement suggested other guards on other duties, but they were too distant to worry about a child hidden in the tree line. The forest around her exhaled slowly, testing whether it was truly safe to resume its usual murmurs. An owl called again from some invisible perch and the branches overhead whispered quietly to each other. All the familiar sounds resumed their places, but to the girl they no longer sounded simple. They seemed to form a backdrop to something larger, something that had just stepped out from behind her old understanding of the world. She lowered herself into a sitting position, drawing her feet close and wrapping her arms around her knees. The chill in the ground soaked through the fabric of her dress, but she barely noticed it. Her thoughts ran in tight, frantic circles, returning again and again to the words she had heard in that other language, the words for ambush, for first strike, for broken alliances. She repeated the conversation silently, retracing its phrases as carefully as a traveler retraces their steps after realizing they may be lost. Each time she did, the meaning remained the same. There was no comforting misinterpretation to be found, no gentler explanation hiding between the lines. The guards had spoken openly of betrayal. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone that had not been there before. It was heavy and cold and stubborn. She tried to imagine setting it aside, simply standing up and walking back the way she had come, down through the trees toward the stream, past the familiar twisted elm and the fallen log where mushrooms grew like small, pale ears. She could picture herself slipping silently into the cottage, lying down on her straw pallet, pulling the thin blanket over her shoulders. She could even imagine pretending to sleep while the body around her gradually relaxed and warmed with the comfort of a known place. Yet the stone of knowledge refused to move. When she pictured herself at the well the next morning, waiting in line behind women with tired hands and baskets of laundry, hearing them talk nervously of the meeting at the castle and what it might mean for harvests and winter supplies, the stone only grew heavier. She imagined them looking up toward the distant black shape of the fortress with the wary hope of people who had no choice but to rely on powers they feared. She imagined those same faces weeks later, learning that everything had gone wrong, that their ruler and his guests had died or vanished in a storm of treachery, that new, harsher orders now came from unfamiliar mouths. She saw herself listening in silence, knowing she had once crouched behind a rock while the first outlines of that disaster were drawn in the air beside her. The thought made her stomach twist. She buried her face against her knees, trying to breathe slowly. The path before her seemed split into two very clear directions now. One led back to her small, narrow life, where she could pretend not to have heard anything, where she would remain an unnoticed shadow on the edge of events. The other led upward, toward the castle and everything that waited inside it, toward the vampire king whose name adults spoke with a mixture of dread and resignation. The first path felt safer in the way that hiding under a table during a storm feels safe, though the house above might still be splitting apart. The second path felt like stepping out into the open, directly into the wind and the rain, with nothing but her own thin body as shield. It would have been easy to tell herself that it was not her responsibility. She was only a child. The affairs of kings and councils and ambushes were meant for those who wore armor and carried titles. Somewhere, surely, there were adults better suited to this knowledge, people with connections and authority, people whose warnings would be believed and acted upon. She searched in her memory for such a person in the village, someone who spoke the old language as she did, someone who might have been standing nearby on the path, listening unseen. No face came to mind. The traveler who had once stopped at the well, speaking gently in the tongue she remembered from before, had long since moved on. No one else in the village ever used those syllables, not even in private. The more she thought about it, the more alone she felt with the information pressing against her ribs. The stone of knowledge had no desire to be passed to another pair of hands, there were no other hands to take it. She realized, with a clarity that made her tremble, that the world did not always arrange itself so that burdens found the shoulder's best shape to carry them. Sometimes they fell where they fell, and whoever happened to be beneath them had to decide whether to stand up under the weight or let it crush them to the ground. Her thoughts slid then toward the castle itself, toward the figure at its center. The Vampire King belonged to the kind of stories that children heard when adults grew careless or too tired to guard their tongues. Some said he had ruled for longer than any human could count, his reign stretching back through generations like a road disappearing into fog. Others insisted that he had won the castle from another creature just as terrible, his victory sealed with blood and iron. The details conflicted, but the general shape remained the same, he was dangerous, powerful, and not to be approached lightly. She tried to imagine walking into his presence. The image that came was vague and shadowed, made of all the warnings she had heard. She felt the brush of an imagined gaze, like cold fingertips on the back of her neck, the sense of standing before someone who could see through lies and fear and the false fronts adults often wore. It was frightening, but threaded through that fear was another thought, quieter and stranger. A creature who had lived through so many nights, who had navigated centuries of plots and threats, might know what to do with the knowledge she carried. He might be the only one in this land who could truly understand the danger described in those Russian phrases and act quickly enough to stop it. The idea of being ignored, of not being believed, had been lingering at the edges of her thoughts, a smaller fear curled inside the larger one. Children were often told to stay quiet when important matters were at hand. What if she somehow found a way into the castle, found someone willing to carry her words upward, only to have them dismissed as the babbling of a frightened girl who had misheard things she barely understood? That would be another kind of failure, and perhaps worse than staying silent in the first place, because it would leave her exposed and powerless in the center of danger. Yet the memory of the guard's tone, their grim satisfaction as they described positions and timing, would not let her cling to that fear as an excuse. She remembered too well the exact word used for ambush, the way it carried a sense of sudden closing, like jaws snapping shut around prey. There had been no uncertainty in their plans. They had not speculated or wondered. They had rehearsed. The confidence in their voices made it harder to believe that she might be entirely wrong. She lifted her head and stared up the path again. The lanterns climbed the hill in a crooked line toward the looming bulk of the castle. Behind that dark mass lay halls and chambers she had never seen, corridors and stairways and hidden corners unknown to anyone outside the walls. Somewhere in that maze the Vampire King was preparing for the meeting that had drawn so much activity to his domain. Servants hurried, scribes consulted lists, messengers came and went. None of them knew that 6 guards had stood here in the night and plotted how to turn that planned gathering into a scene of chaos and blood. The thought that she might arrive too late pressed against her. Time, which had seemed so wide and vague a few hours earlier when she had slipped out to watch the hill, now felt like a narrow corridor closing steadily around her. Every moment she remained behind the rock was a moment in which preparations continued above unchecked. The stone of knowledge inside her pulsed with urgency. It no longer felt like something she carried, it felt like something that was pushing her forward. Her body responded before her mind had fully formed the decision. She released her grip on her knees, planting her palms on the cold ground and pushing herself upright. Her legs tingled with pins and needles from staying in one position too long, but she waited only a breath before stepping out of the hollow behind the rock. The air outside her hiding place hit her like a splash of cold water. Without the stone at her back, she felt exposed, but also strangely lighter. The choice had shifted from possibility to reality. She glanced down the hill once, toward the direction of the village, where a faint smear of orange on the horizon hinted at cooking fires and hearths. It would be so easy to walk that way, to let the shadows of the trees wrap around her and carry her back to familiar ground. For an instant, her feet almost turned in that direction of their own accord, drawn by the gravity of habit. But the image of the future she had imagined, the meeting hall transformed into a killing ground, the shockwaves reaching all the way to those distant fires, rose up again, vivid and insistent. She could not shake the sense that if she turned away now, she would be turning away not just from the castle, but from every life that might be altered by what was being planned. Slowly, deliberately, she turned instead toward the hill. The lanterns flickered above her, each one marking another step into territory where she was not meant to go. She did not walk on the path itself, that would be the first place any patrol would look. Instead, she began to move along the edge of the forest, parallel to the road, her small form slipping from one patch of shadow to the next. The ground here was uneven, furrowed by roots and dotted with rocks, but she knew it better than most. Her many evenings spent watching the castle had taught her where she could move quietly and quickly without snapping twigs or sliding in loose soil. As she climbed, she let her thoughts settle into a different pattern, shifting from the weight of what she knew to the practical question of what she should do next. Knowing that an ambush was planned and deciding to warn the Vampire King were only the first steps. She still had to figure out how to reach anyone close enough to him to listen. The outer gates would be guarded. The main doors would likely be closed to anyone without a clear purpose. She was just a child in a plain dress, with no token of authority, no letter of introduction, nothing to prove she was anything other than a trespasser. But the castle, for all its strength, was not a seamless shell. She had spent enough nights studying it from various angles to know that even the strongest walls had small imperfections. There were places where tree roots had pushed stones slightly apart, where time had worn mortar into dust, where old repairs had not quite matched the original design. She had never dared approach close enough to test those weaknesses before. Tonight, she would have to. As she climbed higher, the trees began to thin. The looming sides of the castle rose above her, their dark surfaces only occasionally broken by narrow windows that glowed faintly from within. She could hear more activity now, the clatter of hooves in the courtyard, the distant rumble of carts being unloaded, the low murmur of voices layered one over another until they formed a background hum. The air carried the smell of smoke from many torches, mingled with the faint, metallic tang of blood that seemed to cling permanently to this place. Just below the level of the outer wall, the forest gave way to a strip of rocky ground where moss struggled to hold on. Here she slowed, moving with exaggerated care, using every outcrop and patch of scrub to hide her approach. In her mind she held a clear image of a particular spot she had studied from afar on previous nights, where a large tree grew unusually close to the wall, its thick roots sinking into the foundation stones. From her vantage points it had seemed that the pressure of those roots had shifted some of the blocks, creating a narrow gap low to the ground. She had often wondered whether a small animal could squeeze through. Tonight, she hoped that a child might not be much larger than such an animal. She reached the base of the wall near that tree and pressed herself against the rough bark for a moment, catching her breath. Her fingers skimmed over the surface of the trunk, feeling the ancient strength locked in its heartwood. The tree had stood here long before the castle was built, and the builders had worked around it, unable or unwilling to cut it down. Its roots had kept growing in spite of their efforts, pushing against stone the way water pushes against everything that tries to contain it. The girl felt an odd kinship with those roots, with their quiet insistence on finding a way through. When her breathing had steadied, she shifted to the side, crouching low as she examined the line where the tree roots met the wall. There it was, just as she had hoped, a dark, narrow space where two stones did not quite touch, widened by the slow, relentless pressure of living wood. From a distance it had looked barely large enough for a fox. Up close, with the cold rough edges inches from her nose, it still seemed impossibly tight. But she had always been small, and hunger and hard winters had kept her smaller. She gauged the width with her hands, briefly closed her eyes, and then let them open again with a new steadiness. The decision to try felt like the completion of the choice she had made behind the rock. She had turned away from safety, now she would move toward the heart of danger. Beyond this gap lay the inside of the castle grounds, with all the risks they contained. If she could pass through, there might be paths and shadows that would lead her closer to someone who could act on her warning. If she could not, she would retreat and be left with the knowledge that she had at least tried the only route available to her. She lowered herself to the ground, pressing one shoulder, then the other, into the space between the stones. The cold, gritty surfaces scraped her arms and caught at her clothes. She exhaled slowly, flattening herself as much as she could, and began to inch forward into the darkness beneath the wall, carrying the weight of her knowledge with her like a secret flame she could not allow to go out. The stone pressed against her shoulders and ribs as she slid forward, the narrow space swallowing her like a rigid throat. Dust scraped her cheek, and tiny loose fragments of mortar crumbled beneath the pressure of her hands. The smell here was a close, stale blend of old earth and trapped air, like the breath of a place that rarely inhaled anything new. For a few heartbeats she could not move at all, the wall, the roots, and her own body seemed locked together in a cramped knot. Panic tried to rise, quick and sharp, urging her to jerk backward and fight free of the gap. She forced it down, concentrating on the slow push of her elbows and the steady pressure of her toes against the ground behind her. Every inch gained felt like a small victory against the weight of stone. She let out air in thin strands, flattening herself further, willing her bones to feel softer, her muscles to thin and lengthen. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, so loud she half expected the guards patrolling above to hear it echoing through the mortar. The roots around her were like black, frozen veins, thick where they emerged from the soil and thinner where they threaded between the blocks. One scraped her arm as she passed, leaving a faint sting that grounded her more firmly in the moment. Forward was the only possible direction now. There was no room to twist around and retreat. The darkness inside the wall was complete, broken only by slivers of faint orange leaking through minuscule cracks in the stones above from unseen torches. Those thin threads of light guided her sense of progress. When one hairline gleam shifted from above to behind, she knew she was nearly through. With one last push, she felt her shoulders clear the tightest point, and suddenly the space opened just enough that she could move more freely. Cool air brushed her face from the other side, carrying scents that did not belong to forest or hill, smoke from many fires, hot metal, animal sweat, and the sour tang of too many bodies crowded into the same space. She wriggled the rest of the way out and emerged in a shallow depression between the outer wall and a low stack of crates. For a moment she lay still on her side, drawing in deep, careful breaths while her skin cooled where it had been scraped and pinched. It was darker here than on the hillside, but in a different way. The darkness felt more contained, shaped and trimmed by human hands. Lanterns burned farther off, their light distorted by passing figures and the shadows of carts. The uneven ground beneath her palms was hardened by years of footsteps, packed into something almost like stone. When she pushed herself upright to a crouch and peered around the crates, the castle's inner yard unfolded before her piece by piece, like a scene revealed behind a curtain. She saw a long line of stables along one side, doors half open as horses shifted and stamped within. Steam rose from their nostrils into the cool air. Nearby, grooms moved with brisk efficiency, brushing coats, adjusting harnesses, lifting hooves to check for stones lodged in iron shoes. A cluster of wagons stood near the main gate, some already empty, others still being relieved of barrels and crates that thudded softly when lowered to the ground. Closer to the center of the courtyard, servants crossed and recrossed the open space with baskets, trays, folded fabrics, and bundles of candles. The flow of their movements traced invisible paths, each person following a route practiced enough that they avoided one another with minimal effort. The collective rhythm suggested a single enormous organism shifting its weight from one side to another in preparation for something significant. No one looked up toward the walls. Their gazes stayed fixed on tasks, on the doors they had to reach, on the orders they were following. The girl absorbed all of this in a series of quick glances, never letting her eyes linger too long on any one point. She knew that open staring could draw attention as surely as a shouted name. Her size, which had always made it easier for others to overlook her, would be an advantage here if she used it correctly. She dropped lower, reducing her outline against the stacked crates, and considered her next move. The main doors that led into the castle's interior were wide and tall, crafted for the passage of wagons and large groups. From here, they glowed with lamplight and torchlight, a steady stream of people moving in and out. But that entrance would be the most carefully watched. Guards stood on either side, their eyes sharp and their hands resting lightly on weapons. Anyone entering there would need a reason, something that could be explained quickly and accepted even more quickly by men used to sniffing out the unusual. Instead, she searched for smaller doors, less important to the flow of traffic, but just as effective for her purpose. Servants' entrances, side passages, narrow stairwells used by those who needed to move quietly from one duty to the next. It did not take long to spot one, a narrow, arched doorway half hidden by a stacked rack of firewood, its stone threshold worn smooth by many feet. Servants slipped through it with laden arms and returned moments later empty-handed, moving at a pace that suggested urgency but not panic. Between her hiding place and that doorway stretched a strip of open ground. Crossing it would mean stepping out where anyone could see her. Waiting too long would not make it less risky, it would only waste precious time. She watched the ebb and flow of bodies until she could sense a rhythm to their movements, the moments when clusters of people overlapped and lines of sight were briefly blocked. When she felt a small pocket of opportunity approaching, she gathered herself and moved. She kept low, not crawling but bent enough that her outline would merge with the shifting shapes of crates and barrels. Her bare feet made less sound than boots would have, her steps absorbing the impact of each landing instead of letting it echo. Once, a servant carrying a heavy basket emerged from behind a cart so suddenly that she had to flatten herself against a stack of sacks, her heartbeat flaring in her throat. The servant passed within arm's reach, eyes turned inward towards some list of tasks. The girl waited until the sound of receding footsteps folded back into the general noise, then slid onward. Reaching the shadow of the firewood rack felt like stepping into a sanctuary carved into the chaotic motion of the yard. The stacked logs smelled of sap and smoke, their rough ends pressed together in irregular rows. The doorway behind them opened onto a dim corridor, a seam in the stone that invited her forward. She slipped into it, the sleeve of her dress brushing the splintered edge of a log, and the sounds of the courtyard softened behind her as the heavy door eased closed on its own weight. Inside, the air cooled by several degrees. The corridor was narrow and lined with plain, functional stone, its floor bearing the scuffs and scratches of constant use. Sconces held small lamps whose flames flickered weakly, just enough to keep the darkness from swallowing everything. The girl pressed herself to one wall as a pair of servants hurried past her in the opposite direction, balancing a wooden crate between them. Their attention was fixed on the corridor ahead, on whatever overseer waited at the far end. They did not seem to register the small figure half hidden in a fold of shadow. Once they were gone, she began to move again, always with one ear attuned to approaching steps. The castle interior revealed itself not in grand halls but in these quieter arteries, the routes used by those who made certain that grand halls could function as intended. She passed open doorways that offered glimpses of storerooms piled with linens and candles, of kitchens where heat pressed against the threshold like a living thing, of narrow staircases spiraling up and down into deeper layers of stone. She had no map, but she had instinct and a sense of the building's heartbeat. The deeper she moved, the more clearly she could feel where the energy gathered. Somewhere above, there would be rooms prepared for the meeting, spaces guarded more heavily, polished more thoroughly, lit more brightly. The paths of servants would converge on those locations like streams feeding a lake. She followed the direction from which the greatest number of footsteps seemed to come, always choosing the stairs that bore fresher scuff marks and the corridors where the air carried hints of scented oil and fresh wax. At one landing she paused, her hand resting on the cool stone of the wall as she listened. Above, the murmur of voices thickened, layered and complex. It was a different kind of sound than the hurried practicality of the lower levels. There was more space between the words here, more weight in each syllable. The people speaking were not carrying trays or ledgers, they were planning, confirming, rehearsing. She climbed toward that sound, the steps worn into shallow dips by countless ascents and descents. As she emerged into a higher corridor, she noticed changes in the surroundings. The stone underfoot was smoother, the walls adorned with tapestries instead of left bare. The lamps were brighter, their holders more ornate. Even the air felt subtly different, touched by faint perfumes instead of only smoke and sweat. This was a place closer to the center of power, where appearances mattered more and the weight of decisions hung thicker. Her presence here was more incongruous than in the kitchens and storage rooms below. A child in plain clothes could pass for a servant's helper in the lower levels. Up here, anyone moving without clear purpose risked drawing attention. The girl adjusted her posture, trying to mirror the quiet assurance she had seen in people who belonged in such spaces. She walked with deliberate steps, neither hurried nor hesitant, as if she were simply one more small piece of the machinery that kept the castle running. It worked for a short while. She passed a pair of scribes consulting a scroll, their heads close together, they did not look up. A woman in finer clothing strode past in the opposite direction, her thoughts obviously turned inward towards some pressing concern. A door opened briefly to reveal a room where garments of dark, rich fabric hung on stands, ready for someone to don before appearing in front of important eyes. The door closed again, shutting away the glimpse of color and texture. Then she reached a broader landing, where the corridor widened into a sort of antechamber overlooking a smaller hall below. Here the sense of being near the core of events throbbed more strongly. From the balustrade she could see the edge of a space that might lead toward formal rooms, high ceilings, polished floors, light pooling from unseen chandeliers. More importantly, she saw them, two guards stationed on either side of a large, ornate door, their stances both relaxed and ready in the way of men who stood watch not over stone, but over something that actually mattered. Their armor was finer than that of the patrol she had spied on outside. Etched patterns caught the light along the edges of their breastplates and gauntlets, hinting at years of service or some special appointment. The way they carried themselves marked them as belonging to the Vampire King's inner circle, trusted to stand close to whatever or whoever lay beyond that door. They were not merely decorative. The quiet awareness in their eyes as they scanned their surroundings showed that. The girl halted at the edge of the landing's shadow, her heart tightening. This door, she felt instinctively, guarded access to a space that drew all the energy of the castle inward. Whether it was the Vampire King's private chamber, a council room, or some other critical place, she could not say, but the sensation that the ruler himself was near washed over her like a cold wave. The air seemed thinner here, as if each breath had to pass a test before entering and leaving a body. Approaching those guards openly would mean stepping out of anonymity and into scrutiny. Yet every path that avoided them led away from the heart of the castle, back into a warren of rooms and corridors where decisions were carried out but not made. If the warning she carried were to reach the one person capable of reshaping the knight's plans, it would need to pass through this point. For a few moments she simply watched them, trying to understand how they might react to something unexpected. One shifted his weight slightly, adjusting the strap of his armor. The other tilted his head once, in the manner of someone listening not just with ears but with a predator's broader senses, absorbing subtle changes in the environment. They looked formidable, but not entirely unapproachable. There was no lazy contempt in their gazes, no slackness in their posture. These were not the careless conspirators she had overheard on the path. She stepped forward. The motion felt enormous, though it carried her only a few paces out of the sheltering shadow. The guards noticed her at once, their eyes sharpened, bodies angling infinitesimally toward her. She stopped a respectful distance away, letting them see her clearly, a small, thin child in plain clothes, unarmed, breathing a little faster than normal but standing upright with deliberate control. One guard's hand twitched toward his weapon, then eased away as he reassessed the lack of threat. Suspicion remained, layered now with confusion. Children did not wander unsupervised into this part of the castle. Their expressions asked questions that their mouths did not need to form. She felt them weighing possibilities, a servant's stray child, a thief, a curiosity, a distraction sent by someone else. She let her gaze meet theirs without flinching. In that wordless connection she poured everything she could not say aloud. She let the urgency of her purpose show in the tightness of her jaw, the steadiness of her posture, the way her hands were clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking. Years of watching adults from corners and behind half-closed doors had taught her how much could be communicated without speech. This was a different kind of eavesdropping in reverse, offering information instead of stealing it, with only the thin thread of shared understanding to hold on to. Her mind flickered back to the conversation on the hill, to the Russian words that had sunk claws into her thoughts. She did not speak them now, not aloud, but she let the memory of them rise behind her eyes. Ambush. First strike. Broken trust. Blood spilled under the guise of diplomacy. The idea of the vampire king walking into that carefully arranged snare hung between her and the guards like an invisible banner. Something in her gaze must have carried that weight across the space. The guard closest to her frowned, studying her with new intensity. He glanced once at his companion, a silent exchange that contained more meaning than any spoken sentence. Doubt wrestled briefly with routine in their eyes. Routine said that strange children should be removed from sensitive areas quickly and quietly, returned to kitchens or tossed out into the yard. Doubt asked why such a child would risk climbing into the castle's heart at all. At last, the nearer guard shifted his stance, no longer blocking the door as fully as before. He extended one hand, not an invitation exactly, but in a gesture that told her to come closer. Her chest tightened. The space between them felt suddenly more dangerous than any passage under the wall had been. Stone had no opinion of who moved through it, people did. Yet this was the opening she had hoped for, however precarious. She stepped forward until she stood almost within reach of his outstretched hand, close enough to see the faint tracery of old scars along his knuckles. He studied her a moment longer, then turned and rapped once on the great door behind him. The sound was dull but carried, muffled by the heavy wood and whatever hangings lay beyond. It was a signal, she realized, one practiced for situations that did not fit neatly into expected patterns. A beat of silence followed, thick and attentive. Then mechanisms she could not see shifted inside the door, quiet but decisive. The guards changed their positions in a subtle but meaningful way, adjusting their distance from the entrance, preparing for it to open. The girl felt the pull of what lay beyond like a tide. She stood on the threshold not of a room, but of the moment her knowledge would move from her own thin frame into a wider world. Behind her, the corridors and stairwells and hidden gaps waited, offering countless routes back into obscurity. Ahead, the door prepared to admit her into the presence of the ancient will that ruled this place. She drew in a slow breath, feeling the air scrape the back of her throat, heavy with wax and stone and a faint undertone of something older. The hand of the nearest guard descended to rest lightly once more on his weapon, not in threat to her, but in acknowledgement of the significance of whoever would soon stand before them. The other guard's gaze remained fixed on her, as if trying to memorize the shape of the child who had appeared from nowhere at such an inconvenient and potentially important time. When the great door began to open, the faint shift of motion seemed to vibrate through her bones. Light spilled out, warmer and steadier than that in the corridor, carrying with it a deeper silence that swallowed the outer noises. For an instant she stood on the cusp between two worlds, the labyrinth of preparation and ordinary fear behind her, and the concentrated heart of power ahead. Then, gathering the fragile courage that had brought her from the forest shadows to this inner threshold, she stepped forward into whatever waited beyond. The room she entered felt at first like the inside of a held breath. The air was still, yet heavy with the invisible weight of attention. Light came from many candles set in tall stands and hanging fixtures, their flames steady and almost unnaturally calm. They cast a warm, controlled glow over the space, leaving few shadows large enough to hide in. The walls were draped with dark fabrics that drank in sound as well as light, softening any noise into a muted murmur. The floor beneath her feet was smooth stone, polished to a dull sheen that reflected faint hints of movement but not enough to form clear images. At the far end of the chamber, slightly raised above the rest of the floor, stood a high-backed chair that was almost a throne but not quite. It lacked some of the grand flourishes she might have expected, yet its shape and position announced its importance more loudly than any ornament could. In that chair sat the vampire king. He appeared at first glance like a figure carved from the same night that pressed against the castle windows, his posture composed, his presence filling the room even without a single outward motion. His clothing was dark but finely made, its details visible only upon closer study, subtle embroidery along the cuffs, a faint metallic shimmer at the edge of a collar, small tokens of rank or history pinned where only careful eyes would notice. His face carried the marks of long time spent watching the rise and fall of days and years. There was no softness in his features, but neither was there crude cruelty. Instead there was an old, patient sharpness, as though every line had been etched there by choices weighed and consequences endured. His eyes, when they lifted fully to her, were the color of deep water at night, reflecting light without seeming to need it. They moved over her in a single, assessing sweep that felt like a hand passing through the layers of her thoughts. Near him, at a respectful distance, stood a small cluster of figures in finer clothing than the servants below. Some held scrolls or ledgers, others stood empty-handed but attentive. Advisors, perhaps, or officers entrusted with carrying his decisions outward into the corridors and courtyards. Their conversation, whatever it had been, had already faded. They watched the child in the doorway now, their expressions tight with confusion, annoyance, or wary curiosity. The interruption was unexpected. Everything else about this night had been carefully ordered. A small, dirt-smeared girl appearing at the center of it did not fit any plan. The guards closed the door behind her, and the soft thud of wood settling into place seemed to seal her into this space, cutting off all retreat. The girl felt the weight of every pair of eyes resting on her small frame. For a heartbeat, the enormity of what she had done surged through her, threatening to break apart the fragile structure of courage she had built. She stood on stone that had never been meant for her feet, under a gaze that had never been meant to fall on her face. The contrast between the life she knew and the place she now occupied stretched so wide it made her dizzy. Yet the knowledge she carried pressed at her ribs like a hand from within, reminding her why she had crawled through earth and slipped past watchful men. The ambush on the hill, the Russian words for first strike and broken alliances, the images of a meeting hall turned to a slaughter ground, all of it rose up again, too vivid to ignore. The stone of responsibility in her chest had become something sharper, demanding to be placed where it might actually change what would happen. The Vampire King regarded her for a long, unbroken moment. He did not move, yet the quality of the stillness in the room shifted around him. Something in his gaze narrowed, not in anger but in interest. There was no doubt that he could sense more than the visible details of a scene, the faint tremor in her hands, the streaks of dust on her clothes, the underlying scent of the forest clinging to her skin. He would be able to hear her heart, feel the echo of fear and resolve that rolled off her like heat from a suppressed fire. In this close space, there was no way to disguise the urgency running through her. She took a few steps forward, leaving the small pool of shadow near the door behind. Each step felt measured by the silence pressing in on her. She did not drop to her knees or bow in the elaborate ways she had seen adults mimic when speaking of those in power. She did not know the correct forms for such things, and any attempt might have looked clumsy or insincere. Instead, she stood as straight as she could manage, letting the weariness of climbing and crawling fall away from her posture as much as possible. Without words, she began to offer up what she knew. Her language and his might have been different, but there were other ways to tell a story. She let her hands move carefully, describing the curve of the hill path, the circle of armored figures under the lantern light, the way they had stood near her hiding place unaware that anyone could understand them. Her fingers traced the line of their march, the place where they had stopped, the way their heads had bent together in low conversation. Her eyes shifted as she recalled their expressions, the tightness at the corners of their mouths, the cold satisfaction that had tinged their tones. In her mind, she stepped back into that moment and walked through it again, inviting the king's gaze to follow. She shaped the memory of the Russian words silently on her lips, knowing he would not understand the tongue but hoping he would feel the weight those particular sounds carried. The word for ambush, the word for first blow, the phrase for striking while trust held the target still, the syllables moved without sound, but she let the fear they had sparked fill her eyes. She mimed the abrupt closing of a trap, hands snapping together as if around something fragile but important. The advisors shifted uneasily. Some exchanged glances, irritable at the interruption, others more thoughtful as the pattern of her gestures became harder to dismiss as random. One frowned deeply, perhaps recognizing that the girl was not simply a frightened child but a witness trying to communicate something specific. The Vampire King remained motionless, though the focus in his gaze intensified. He watched the way she described the placement of blades, the suggested positions on balconies and near doors, the moment when ceremonial routine would draw attention to one point while danger surged from another. She moved her hands to show the gathering itself, spreading her arms as though encompassing a room full of people. She indicated one central figure, her hand hovering near where his own seat stood, then more around it, the important guests whose presence would signal to the world that the meeting carried real significance. Her motions showed them relaxed at first, expectant, perhaps even hopeful. Then the scene changed. Her hands jerked as if startled, then flung outward in chaos, fingers splayed to mimic the scattering of people who had believed themselves secure. Her arms crossed abruptly to symbolize barriers and closing exits, the lethal narrowing of choices. To this she added the echoes of the broader consequences she had imagined behind the rock. Her hands drew outward, tracing ripples that moved from an imaginary hall into surrounding lands, villages, outlying keeps, roads that carried goods and messengers. She let the shape of that imagined future bloom for an instant in the space between them, fields left unplanted or untended, walls blackened, unfamiliar banners raised where old ones had been torn down. Then, just as quickly, she closed her hands around it as though crushing something before it could fully form, her gaze locking once more on the king. The room had grown even quieter while she moved. No one interrupted her with questions. The advisor's earlier annoyance had thinned into something more strained, a tension born of not knowing how much of what she relayed might be true, but also not daring to dismiss it outright in front of the one who ruled them. The guards by the door stood as still as carved figures, yet their attention remained alert, sensing that whatever passed between child and king in this moment would decide the shape of the hours to come. The vampire king finally shifted, the small motion carrying the sense of a mountain deciding to lean toward one side. He considered her with a gaze that weighed not just her story, but her presence, the improbable path that must have brought her here. He would know the rhythm of this night's plans better than anyone, the names of every important guest expected to walk through his halls, the routes his own guards were scheduled to take. The idea of treachery within those carefully arranged patterns would not be a new one, rulers who survived as long as he had did so by always assuming that danger could bloom from familiarity. Something unreadable passed through his expression, a flicker that might have been recognition, suspicion, or simply calculation taking on a new variable. If he doubted the precise details of her warning, he could not easily ignore the possibility of its core. The fact that she had reached him at all, slipping through defenses and walls meant to keep such intrusions at bay, argued for treating her as more than a stray child. The memory of her climb, her passage under the wall, the long corridors navigated on instinct and desperation, might not have been visible to him, but the consequences of that journey stood before him now in the form of one thin, dirt-streaked figure. Orders began to move, first in subtle ways, carried by looks and hand signals, then in more direct ones. He inclined his head once toward one of the advisors, a man whose clothing marked him as responsible for logistics or arrangements. That man's expression tightened, he bowed his head and stepped back from the circle around the throne-like chair. He left the room swiftly, his footsteps swallowed almost immediately by the heavy fabrics on the walls and the cushioned floors of the outer corridors. The girl could not hear what passed beyond these walls, but she could imagine the chain reaction, messages sent to the staff responsible for setting the hall, quiet instructions given to those in charge of welcoming guests, small but significant changes introduced into a schedule that had been polished over days. The meeting that had been planned as a single, precise event began to unravel under the pressure of doubt. Times were shifted, first by a small margin, then more boldly. Some key participants were delayed with polite excuses, others summoned earlier than expected. Routes through the castle were changed under the pretext of improved security or convenience. Word would spread through the ranks of the guards as well, though in a more controlled fashion. Patrols were rearranged, with some faces moved away from critical points and others replaced by men whose loyalty had been tested more thoroughly. Archways and staircases that had been accessible were suddenly closed, watched by unfamiliar eyes. Silent checks would be made on arms and armor, on the disposition of men who had seemed unremarkable the day before. In quiet corners, those with something to hide might feel a new tightness at the base of their throats without yet knowing why. The conspiracy that had trusted so heavily in fixed times and predictable patterns would find the ground shifting beneath it. Signals planned for one moment would arrive at another, missing their intended targets. Allies waiting just beyond the walls for some sign that the snare had closed would see nothing that matched the promised sequence. Within the castle, those guards who had spoken freely in Russian on the hill might notice that their usual positions had been changed, that they were now stationed far from the hall they had expected to flood with violence. They might tell themselves it was coincidence, but unease would creep between them. All of this moved outward from a single decision made in the quiet center of the chamber, a decision the girl could not hear verbalized but could sense in the altered tension of the air. The Vampire King did not leap to his feet or rage against invisible enemies. He did not need to. The power he held expressed itself in quieter ways, in the efficient redirection of human and inhuman resources, in the subtle unmaking of a night's anticipated shape. The meeting did not vanish entirely, such a thing would have caused its own upheaval. Instead, it fractured and reformed, its most vulnerable configuration discarded in favor of something more unpredictable. She stood very still while this invisible work unfolded, watching the movement of those still in the room. Another advisor departed, perhaps to send messages farther afield, to alert allies who would have been traveling or waiting in neighboring lands. Someone else approached the king's side with a slim ledger, pointing out entries that, when reconsidered, might reveal unusual clusters of responsibility or access. The pattern of who knew what and who held which keys was being re-evaluated in the light of her warning. Time stretched, but not in the suffocating way it had behind the rock. Here, it felt taut and active, like a rope pulled tight between many hands. At last, the immediate flurry of responses slowed. The room's stillness returned, but its quality had changed. The sense of an impending, unseen blow had lessened, replaced by the more familiar weight of controlled risk, the constant companion of anyone seated at the heart of power. The Vampire King's gaze settled on her again. In that look there was no obvious gratitude, no softening into something that might be mistaken for warmth. But there was acknowledgement. He had not dismissed her as a nuisance, nor had he permitted anyone else to treat her that way. Her presence had been accepted as a factor in his calculations, her warning unfolded and examined instead of being brushed aside. Whatever passed between them in that sustained regard did not need words. She felt a faint loosening of the tight band that had wrapped around her chest since she first crouched behind the rock. The future that stretched out before the castle no longer seemed fixed in the single catastrophic shape she had imagined. Other possibilities had been allowed room to grow. The meeting would still have consequences, alliances would still be formed or strained, but the precise image of banners torn and wine mixed with blood had dissolved. She realized suddenly how tired she was. The climb up the hill, the crawl under the wall, the careful navigation of unfamiliar corridors, the effort of standing in this chamber of imposed stillness and holding herself upright under the weight of many eyes, all of it settled into her bones at once. Her legs felt hollow, her shoulders heavy. Yet beneath the fatigue ran a thin, bright thread of something else, something almost like relief. She had carried the stone of knowledge as far as she could. It no longer rested solely on her small frame. Eventually, she was guided from the room, not by force or harsh hands, but by a firm, impersonal gesture from one of the guards. The corridors that had seemed so vast and daunting when she first slipped along them now felt narrower, their menace muted. The castle had not become less dangerous, it was still a place built on power and old dark bargains. But she no longer moved through it as someone trying to slip past a sleeping beast. The beast had seen her, and, for reasons she did not fully understand, had chosen not to swallow her whole. She retraced some of her steps with the help of a silent escort, down staircases and along servant passages where the air smelled of cooked food and wax again. Eventually, she found herself near a lesser door that opened onto the outer yard. The guard who had led her there did not linger to watch her go. His duty lay within the walls, not beyond them. The door closed softly behind her, leaving her once more under the open sky. Night had deepened while she had been inside. The clouds had shifted, torn in places to reveal streaks of moonlight. The lanterns along the path burned as before, but she sensed a difference in the patterns of movement around them, a new crispness in the way guards turned their heads, in the positions they chose along the route. Somewhere within those ranks would be the men who had spoken freely in Russian on the hill. They would find fewer of their plans matching the reality unfolding around them. The pieces they had placed on their internal board would no longer align with the game in progress. The forest greeted her with its familiar scents, damp earth, crushed leaves, the faint sweetness of distant blossoms that bloomed without human attention. She slipped back into the trees, her feet finding the path almost on their own. The hill behind her loomed, but it no longer felt as though it leaned over her with its full weight. It stood instead like a dark monument to a night that had nearly turned another way. By the time she reached the mossy rock that had hidden her earlier, the stone in her chest felt smaller, its edges worn down. She sank into the hollow behind it for a moment, more out of habit than necessity, and listened to the quiet around her. No sudden clamor rose from the castle. No glow of fire stained the clouds above it. The night, for now, remained just a night. Later, when she walked the narrow path back to her cottage near the forest's edge, the world seemed both exactly the same and permanently altered. The villagers would wake the next day and go about their routines, discussing rumors of the meeting, arguing over what its outcomes might mean for them. They would never know how narrowly a different story had been avoided, how close their lives had come to being rearranged by schemes born behind closed teeth and spoken in a foreign tongue. Only a few minds would carry the full shape of what had almost happened and had not. The conspirators, discovering that their careful plan had dissolved into confusion, would feel a creeping sense of exposure. The Vampire King, seated once more in his high-backed chair, would file away the memory of a small intruder whose warning had arrived at a critical moment. And in the forest, a little girl would lie awake for a long while, listening to the sounds of the night and knowing that, just once, the path of a kingdom's future had bent slightly beneath her bare, quiet steps.